I just want to thank our co-sponsors before we get into the lecture. Dale is the primary feature, but I do want to recognize those who've been so kind to support us in all our efforts around Chesterton, and particularly for this event tonight. I want to thank first the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, of which Dale is the president, the Nanovic Institute for European Studies at Notre Dame, the De Nicholas Center for Ethics and Culture, the Office of Notre Dame International, and the Notre Dame College of Arts and Letters, Durham University Center for Catholic Studies, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, and ThinkND. Each of our partners has helped us to bring this together and to share it throughout their networks so that we can continue to promote interest and share scholarship on the work of G.K. Chesterton. As for a little bit of business, we also ask that if you have any questions for Dale that might come to you as he's presenting, we'd ask you to submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This will allow us to facilitate the questions as effectively as possible. So go ahead and submit them as they occur. We'll take them up as Dale completes his talk, and then we'll give the remaining time to Dale fielding some of those questions. And now I want to introduce you to my colleague and friend, Dale Ahlquist, to talk about the Transatlantic Chesterton. Dale, as I mentioned, is president of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, one of the co-sponsors of this event. He's the creator and host of the EWTN series G.K. Chesterton, the Apostle of Common Sense. And he has also serves as publisher of Gilbert Magazine. The author of 5 books, editor of 12, Dale has been called probably, quote, probably the greatest living authority on the life and work of G.K. Chesterton, end quote. I think I'd only drop the probably. A prolific advocate of the life and learning of G.K. Chesterton. He has lectured all over the world. He joins us today, I presume, from his home in Minnesota, which delights me because that's my homeland as well. And we're honored to have him join us today to deliver the 3rd annual Notre Dame Chesterton Lecture. Dale, welcome.
Thank you, Father Lees, for the gracious introduction, for inviting me to give the lecture, and thanks to all the good folks at Notre Dame's London Gateway for putting this whole event together. I certainly wish I could be there in person, across the street there from Trafalgar Square. I am in Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis. The town is called Hopkins. I'm not at my home right now. I'm at the office of the Society of G.K. Chesterton, which is in the same building as Chesterton Academy, the high school that was helped. I helped found it, and so did the work of the Chesterton Society helped found it. But while I'm not there in person, I do have Gilbert and Francis with me here in person. That's really them behind me, and it's really nice to have them here. So the Transatlantic Chesterton, there's really three main points that I want to make under this title, the Transatlantic Chesterton. And the first one is the most obvious one, that it is the 100th anniversary of Chesterton's first trip to America. It was in the January of 1921 when he stepped off the boat in New York from London, and he arrived to just a great reception along with his wife Frances. He traveled to several cities, giving lectures, traveled as far west as Nebraska and Oklahoma, as far south as Tennessee. He went as far north as Montreal, Ottawa, Quebec, Ottawa, and let's see, Toronto, Toronto's technically farther south than Duluth, Minnesota, which is where he also lectured in Duluth. He came to Minneapolis, by the way, Father, but he didn't give a lecture in Minneapolis. He just spent the night at the Minneapolis Radisson, and while he was there, met in the elevator the heavyweight boxer Jack Dempsey, as you would imagine. It's one of the strange quirk meetings. He said, I met the great American pugilist Jack Dempsey. Yeah. Everywhere he went, it was front page news, whether he lectured or not. He was just a gigantic celebrity in more ways than one, and certainly was received warmly everywhere he went. That people were very anxious and curious to meet him in the flesh. He gave a series of 3 lectures that he kept rotating. Primarily, these were the 3 lectures that he gave throughout the country. One was the ignorance of the educated. The second one was the perils of health. And the third one was, shall we abolish the inevitable? In some cities, he gave all 3 lectures. In some, he just gave 1. He also added a 4th lecture during his speaking tour, literature as luggage. And it was from that lecture that he had one of his most famous lines, oft repeated. I know I've never grown tired of quoting it. When asked what book would he want to have with him on a desert island, he said, Thomas's Guide to Practical Shipbuilding. That's the funny answer. But then he also said, most people, when they're asked that question, they would say the Bible or the works of Shakespeare. And naturally, the reason they say that, because that would be the first time they've ever read either of those, would be on that desert island. But when pressed, he did say the one book he would like with him, if he only had one book, Pickwick Papers by Charles Dickens. That was the book he would return to again and again. He was, of course, one of the great experts on Charles Dickens, had written a fabulous criticism of Dickens in 1906, actually, and it helped revive a great interest in Dickens in England, where Dickens was starting to fade. He wrote introductions to all of Dickens' novels, and he did give a talk in New York at a special meeting of the Dickens Fellowship at the National Arts Club. In all of his lectures, there's no complete transcript of any of his lectures, but there's newspaper reports of all of them. And what's interesting is that every reporter brings out something different in what he quotes, but it's also very likely that every lecture was different, because Chesterton was lecturing without notes, and he probably gave, there was probably new lines in each lecture that he gave, whether it was the same title or not. For instance, here's 3 quotes from 3 different newspapers in 3 different cities when he gave the talk, The Ignorance of the Educated. He says, being educated apparently means reading the newspapers. Being properly educated means not believing the newspapers after you've read them. And then more to the heart of things, he says, I personally think most of our theories are false, and our use of them always pedantic and often hypocritical. The ignorance of the educated is just a lack of common sense. In his talks under the perils of health, an amazing range of quotations that come from the different reports from the different cities. Clearly, the theme of that lecture, Perils of Health, was about the fad for health, an obsession with health as a modern fad. And he used that as a launching point to talk about fads in general and the importance of permanent truth and longstanding traditions, which should be more important than the passing fads and fashions. He says that I think that the majority of people are sane about everything. But his idea is that when a fad comes along, a large group of people tend to go temporarily insane. And he points out that we always reform and ridicule not the customs of the remote past, but the customs of the day before yesterday. We're always attacking the most previous fashion, the most previous fad, because they're just beginning to grow old. And he says this is true of furniture and parents. Chesterton, of course, is famous for the great line, often quoted, "A thing worth doing is worth doing badly." Well, he has an interesting variation on that line in one of his Perils of Health lecture. He says, the world is not so anxious to do things worth doing as to do things not worth doing and do them very well. The world is not so anxious to do things worth doing as to do things not worth doing and do them very well. Just let that sink in. We spend a lot of our energy on things that aren't that important. And he points out that something is always lost by almost all technical accomplishments that we gain. Something is lost by almost all the technical accomplishments we gain. Obviously, I have the great pleasure of speaking to people right now all over the world, but I don't have the pleasure of being in the room with you. I have that loss of the personal contact. And then here's a really, then he kind of goes classical on us when he talks about how Socrates represents going against the fads and the fashions. Everyone mentions Socrates as a man who dies because he was a bold exponent of new truths. But if you look closer, you will see that something else is so. Socrates lived in a world of sophists, and there were hundreds and hundreds of men proving that there was no God, no conscience. There were multitudes of anarchists around Socrates. He was the conservative who subdued them. He turned sophistry against the sophists. Socrates is remembered, the rest are forgotten. And then in his talk, shall we abolish the inevitable? The theme of these talks was that most of our modern philosophies tend towards fatalism or determinism, whether it's religious, biological, economic, psychological, sociological. There's always this attack on free will. And Chesterton is arguing, of course, for the importance of a philosophy that honors free will and doesn't take away our freedom, but he also is arguing against all the things in our modern society that are an attack on liberty. In fact, in reference to the great American patriot, Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," Chesterton says, were Patrick Henry to return to Earth and look around on the vast economic order of the day, he might revise his observation and merely say, "Give me death," the alternative being manifestly impossible under modern conditions. The foundation of political liberty is spiritual liberty, the sense that man is an artist and a creator. And that is the real view of the future, which a healthy philosophy ought to restore to mankind. The future is a thing which we create out of ourselves, as a poet creates a poem. Chesterton, of course, was interviewed widely by the press. He was used to being interviewed because reporters would travel to meet him and interview him, and often from the United States, they'd go to England to interview him in his home. But it was a new experience to be, in a public press conference and have reporters shouting questions at him. This was a completely new experience, but it also was an utterly new experience for Frances, who had never been interviewed by the press before. She was used and very comfortable being in the large shadow of her husband, and was a very private person. And suddenly she was thrust into the public limelight, and she handled it very well, but she was utterly unused to it. And she just, when reporters came to her in America, she asked, "Why would you want to interview me?" And they said, "Well, because you're the wife of a celebrity." And she said, "Well, that's just the thing I'm trying to forget." But she also said it astounded Mr. Chesterton that he was treated as a celebrity. He said, "He's the simplest sort of person. Why, we are just ordinary people. And over in England, just a couple of members of a large group of people who are honestly trying to do good work." That's how she saw her husband and herself, just honestly trying to do good work. We live in a little house out in the country, 5 and 20 miles from London, which we call Overroads because it looks out on a couple of roads. Mr. Chesterton has the peculiarity of some big men physically and of his temperament that he can't be really happy in doing work except in a very small room. I've tried again and again to get him to fix up a decent study where he could receive people and in which he would have a decent desk and decent furniture, but he simply won't do it. He has a room so small that he can practically sit at his desk and reach all around the room what he wants. And his desk is nothing but an old kitchen table. He likes that because he can draw on it or hack it to his heart's content. It has been covered with a oilcloth, but that's all hacked up. In the study, he has things that are valuable to him that wouldn't be worth a tuppence to anyone else. A wonderful personal view that if not for their trip to America, we would never have information like that. So God bless those nosy American reporters for finding out things about Francis and Gilbert that the English probably wouldn't have pride enough to find out. I also, in doing some research and looking up things for this talk, found some things that I had not previously discovered. And a couple of new things I just learned was during his many social events that he attended and was invited to, he met among all the other people, the widow of George Armstrong Custer, of Custer's Last Stand, the colorful, controversial soldier who died at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So this would have been 45 years after the event. And Mrs. Custer was almost 80 years old, but she wanted to meet G.K. Chesterton. And the other thing that was interesting I discovered was that while Chesterton was in America, he lost 28 pounds. Apparently, he wasn't eating enough hamburgers and French fries while he was here. In fact, when he arrived, he was actually proved to be a disappointment to many of the reporters and people who came to hear his lectures because they were expecting this gigantic, huge G.K. Chesterton, and he didn't live up to the billing. His great weight was not what they had been led to believe. Chesterton reached his largest weight in about 1914 when he had a physical collapse, and after recovering from that, really was quite a bit thinner. But he continued to lose weight while he was here. In fact, one reporter says, noticed the weight loss. Chesterton's much thinner than he was, though he did break through a chair at breakfast the day I saw him. So he was still carrying some weight. Some of the other reactions of the reporters and people who met him. A reporter from Baltimore says he thinks as a twin-six automobile engine runs. Looks like William Howard Taft coming back to civilization after 2 weeks in the woods, and talks like one of his own brilliant essays. There's no man living who can give a truer picture of the follies of the wise. There can be no mind more agile than Chesterton's, just based on the reactions they've had. When Chesterton speaks, his voice is heard on 4 continents. He's one of the best lecturers I've ever heard. He has a feeling for the reaction of his audience, can adapt very difficult material, and yet he told his audience with the utmost conviction that he could not lecture. Those were 5 different reactions from reporters who saw him. I think one of his other great one-liners while he was in one of his interviews, he says, "I'm not certain that brevity is the soul of wit, but brevity is an excellent substitute for wit." Another reaction. This was in an introduction given by the former governor of New York, Martin Glynn, who, when Chesterton was lecturing in Albany. I think this is before politicians had speechwriters. This was a very astute introduction. He said, some authors have one book in them, some have a library. Chesterton has already produced a library and still has another one in him. He's written and well in all spheres of literature and almost everything under the sun. He's one of the most widely read essayists in the world today. And the reason for this is not hard to find. Most serious writers are so owlishly dull that they make virtue odious and vice attractive. Not so Chesterton. He does not give the devil all the pretty music of life. He gives the devil the discords and humanity the harmonies of existence. He is today the world's wittiest philosopher and the world's most philosophical wit. That's high praise indeed, and really quite astute. So what did Chesterton say about England when he was in America? I think the most notable comment he made was this: England is suffering chiefly from a muddle-headedness, which is the result of abandoning all religion. England is suffering chiefly from a muddle-headedness, which is the result of abandoning all religion. Chesterton found America a much more religious country than England at that time. He said America was a nation with a soul of a church. And he could see that in just the general philosophy of the people that he encountered. However, he saw that America suffered from one particular idea that was mistaken for a religious idea, but it was not a religious idea. And it was, in fact, the same idea that afflicted England. And that idea was Puritanism. He long pointed out the dangers of Puritanism, certainly in his own country. And again, when he came to America, he called it a righteous indignation about the wrong things, the danger of setting up not only false gods, but false devils. And the epitome of Puritanism was Prohibition. And of course, Chesterton entered America just as Prohibition had become the law of the land. And we should point out, it almost became the law in England. It was very, very much in danger of becoming a law in England. And it could be argued that Chesterton was one of the people that prevented it from becoming a law, because he argued so eloquently and so publicly against the idea of prohibition. But when he was in America, he says the great problem of prohibition is that we mix up the cause and the effect. There are two kinds of drinking. If a man is happy, he drinks to express his happiness. That is good drinking. And then there is the case of the man who's so unhappy that he drinks in search of happiness. You do not get at the root of by stopping his drink. To get at the root, you must change the whole system that makes him unhappy. And Chesterton argues that it's the modern industrial system that we live under that makes people wage slaves, and the only pleasure they have in life is escaping to the saloon or the bar at the end of the day. He says we must bring back old customs, dances, songs, beliefs, the things that kept men happy before the modern industrial world was born. And he also pointed out that when you try to make a political solution to a social problem, it usually doesn't work. In fact, political solutions to any problem seldom work. Chesterton argued for localism, local control, people controlling the things that directly affected them. He said a world state would likely be the worst governed the mind of man can conceive. It's hard enough to get representatives to represent when they are right here and we can see them and control them. How can we control them if they are far off? The more distant and centralized a government becomes, the less it represents and the less that we can control the things that are happening to us. He said, it was a mistake to do away with the duel because politicians were sometimes killed in them. Good reference to our friend Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton. Another reason for social misbehavior was due to what Chesterton called the new game of psychoanalysis, which he said deals with a part of ourselves beyond our control and creates a certain amount of irresponsibility. People begin to blame their actions on things they can't control. This is an attack on freedom, on dignity, but it also is, as Chesterton said, at a certain point, a revolt against reason, where people will not take responsibility for their actions. And he also said there's another result of Puritanism. He said very prophetically, it will lead to an outbreak of licentiousness and debauchery. It will cause the exact opposite of what it intends to do. He said the next great heresy is going to be an attack on morality, especially on sexual morality. The madness of tomorrow is not in Moscow, but much more in New York. It was starting to happen, as Chesterton pointed out, when we separated sex from birth and sex from marriage. And Chesterton says you can never, this is what he said in New York, he said, you can never take the tragic element out of sex. Prudent marriage, there is no such thing. The very act of tying oneself to another is itself not prudent. It's an adventure. It's like going to war. There is a ridiculous modern chimera to get rid of the tragedy in sex. The tragedy of sex is the tragedy of the soul of man. So I'm almost done with my lecture, and I've only made 1 point. I said I was going to make 3 points. I have 2 more points to make. So obviously they're going to be very short. When Chesterton was in America the first time, 1921, his lectures were all set up by an agency who arranged the lectures in every city, and they're always set up for large public auditoriums and popularly advertised and attended. He did not give many talks at colleges and universities. One exception was Yale. He was invited to speak at Yale. And this brings up this sort of disconnect between colleges, universities, and G.K. Chesterton. Even during his lifetime, his poems and essays were already being taught and probably required reading in most schools. But his books really never gained much of a traction during his lifetime. Some have continued to be in print since they were first published, but they didn't become college standard texts, as it were. He was always considered a popular writer, not a scholarly one. And certainly, as I pointed out earlier, he was an open critic of the philosophies being taught in most colleges and universities. We talk about the ignorance of the educated, the pedantic theories that defy common sense from all the way across the curriculum, from the humanities to the arts to the sciences. But the reason he came back to the United States 10 years later was that a university invited him back as a guest lecturer for 6 weeks, and that university was Notre Dame. He was now a Catholic. He called Notre Dame the Catholic Heart of America. He was present at the grand opening of the football stadium in 1930, along with Newt Rockney. He was introduced to the audience. They all stood up and gave him a standing ovation. He'd never seen a football game in his life. And he did, however, write a poem called The Arena, where he talks about these bloodless gladiators looking up at the statue of Our Lady that overlooked the campus. And he said, "We who are about to live salute thee." He gave 18 lectures on Victorian literature and 18 lectures on Victorian history. It was considered the great event of the year on the campus. He was given an honorary doctorate from the University of Notre Dame, which made the news in Time magazine. And probably the best collection of Chesterton material in the United States is in the special collections at Notre Dame. And now, of course, Notre Dame's the caretaker of one of the best collections of GKC material in England, with the exception of the British Library. So if this were a more well-organized talk, this would have been a fitting conclusion to a talk with the title of the Transatlantic Chesterton. The fact that Chesterton came from England to America to Notre Dame, and now in effect Notre Dame's come from America to England to Chesterton, housing this great Chesterton collection at its London Gateway campus. But that's not my final point. I'd like to make my final point now. On the occasion of Chesterton's death in 1936, Chesterton was eulogized all across the world, in newspapers all across the world. But I'd like to mention an obituary in the New York Times written by John Kennedy. Not that John Kennedy, no. Not John F. Kennedy, John B. Kennedy, who was a journalist and also a very important broadcaster. In fact, John B. Kennedy has a star on the Hollywood Boulevard Walk of Fame. Now, why do I know that? Because I stepped on it. I was walking down Hollywood Boulevard looking at the stars, and there's John B. Kennedy, the guy who interviewed Chesterton. That's probably why he has a star. My family didn't believe me, but he did travel to England a couple times to interview Chesterton. And then he wrote in his obituary, his eulogy, he wrote, Chesterton's physical enormity was a symbol of his spiritual power. When his voice traversed the Atlantic in too few broadcasts, it was gentle, kindly, humorous, teaching men sanity, expressed sincerely. What his epitaph may be by those who knew him better than I, this it should be for those of us who learned from him that life is worth living. A great soul passed, leaving behind him clues to greatness, and the fullness of his faith and that grace of friendship on which in death intrudes may, despite death, be immortal. A friendship which may be immortal. 100 years after Chesterton's visit to America, Chesterton is present more than ever in our country. In fact, he might be more popular in America than in his native England. The interest in Chesterton here continues to grow. There's over 70 local Chesterton societies around the country that meet on a regular basis and read and discuss his works and his ideas. The Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton has now over 3,000 members. We publish new books with newly collected editions of Chesterton's writing, new books about Chesterton. And then, of course, on our website, we have over 17,000 followers on our social media. And then, of course, there's the Chesterton schools, the Chesterton Academies, classical Catholic schools founded with Chesterton as the model thinker, the complete thinker. There's 35 of these schools now around the country and around the world, with 15 new schools starting next year. There'll be 50 Chesterton Academies next year. The scholarly interest continues to grow in Chesterton, not simply as a literary figure. He's considered by many as a spiritual figure. Himself, one of the notable Catholic converts of the 20th century, G.K. Chesterton is simply a maker of converts. You're looking at one of them right now. I've started a list of the number of people who have become Catholic as a result of reading Chesterton. And I know I'm only scratching the surface, but I have over 500 people on the list. And he's just simply a life-changing writer. And there's people who are befuddled by this, particularly in his native England, almost embarrassed by this. They're still a little uncomfortable in England with the idea that a former Anglican named John Henry Newman not only became Catholic, but became a cardinal and then became a saint. In England, I think they were always stunned by Chesterton's conversion, but the idea now of his being a saint is quite unthinkable. And yet there's thousands of people in the US and around the world who are thinking it. And that thought is not going to go away. But thinking, as Chesterton says, is hard work. It's just about the hardest thing that we do. And that's why most people would rather avoid it. In the meantime, Chesterton's words continue to be discovered and rediscovered, and they bring delight and inspiration. They bring hope in times of despair. They bring faith in times of doubt, and they certainly bring joy in a world that's very cynical and very sad. John B. Kennedy said that this relationship with Chesterton could be a friendship which is immortal. Well, we've become friends with G.K. Chesterton, and I'm thinking that it's proving to be a friendship that is immortal. God bless and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dale. That was quite remarkable, I have to say. You speak of him as though you know him, and in speaking of him with such warmth and such passion, we all feel a bit more like we know him as well as a friend. It's magnificent, and I'm not kidding when I say we're honored to have you. I want to just say one thing. I found this in Maisie Ward's book, her biography of Chesterton. It was written a few years after he died, or maybe 6 or 7. But anyway, it refers to the later visit, the second visit that you referred to when he did come to Notre Dame. And later, Father Leo Ward, one of the Holy Cross priests, and his driver Johnny were reminiscing about the trip. And apparently one said, when he'd been invited to Notre Dame, he was not certain where it was, but with a name like that, even if it were in the mountains on the moon, he should feel at home. And I hope he did. I have a sense from what is recorded of that visit. It was quite a remarkable one, and he was grateful for it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I'm going to start with a question that your son asked me on his podcast on Common Sense, because I thought it was lovely. And I'm sure many people know this story, part of your story, but what was your first encounter with Chesterton upon his work?
Well, I've never told this story before. So I started reading Chesterton, like so many people, on my honeymoon. And I was a big C.S. Lewis fan, and I found out that Chesterton's really the force behind C.S. Lewis. So that's why I decided to pick up the book that C.S. Lewis himself always recommended people read, which was The Everlasting Man. And what better time to read that than on your honeymoon? And so I've been married to Chesterton as long as I've been married to my wife. And as she says, the three of us get along very well.
Thank God for that, huh? I just want to say to our participants, and we welcome your questions in the Q&A function as we move forward. We've got a few already, and so we'll start with those, but we welcome anything you might have to say. One of our folks just wanted to make a comment that not only should Chesterton be a saint, but he should be a doctor of the church. I don't think anyone would argue about his genius. He's clearly a remarkable mind and heart, if you will.
That's one of the great things. This was an astounding genius. And the great thing is that he used his amazing intellectual gifts for the glory of God. And what could be better than that?
Truly, truly. Did Chesterton meet some of the American authors of his time, do you know, such as F. Scott Fitzgerald or Ernest Hemingway?
He didn't meet Hemingway or Fitzgerald, but he did meet Sinclair Lewis. And he was with John Drinkwater, the English playwright who'd written the notable play Lincoln. They were in Chicago. They were at a bookstore together, and they sat down and they were going to plot a play. They're going to each write one act of a play called Mary, Queen of Scotch. And that's as far as that idea got.
Yeah, it didn't fly. That's great. And what
He met some other minor writers that we probably don't know as much about anymore, but some of them, the one that came to mind was the Edwin Markham was a notable poet, American poet, and he was one of the guys who introduced Chesterton at one of his talks.
Excellent. What about church leaders? One person asked if perhaps he had met Fulton Sheen, Archbishop Fulton Sheen.
Yeah, he did meet Fulton Sheen, but that was in England. Fulton Sheen came to England to meet Chesterton and asked Chesterton to write the introduction to his first book. So Chesterton wrote the introduction to Fulton Sheen's first book.
Wow.
And Sheen said very, very publicly that the writer who influenced him the most was G.K. Chesterton. And a lot of those famous G.K. Chesterton, a lot of those famous Fulton Sheen quotes are actually Chesterton quotes, unattributed, because I think they were just in his head. He absorbed them. But I think one of the great ones is, we don't need a church that moves with the world. We need a church that moves the world. It's always attributed to Fulton Sheen, but he got it from Chesterton.
That's marvelous. One of our number in our staff is a proud Tennessean, and he wondered how far south Chesterton got on that earlier trip to the States, or even the latter.
Yeah, he went to Nashville, I think on both of his trips to America. But the first trip he actually made it to Tennessee, and the second trip actually in 1930, after the Notre Dame lectures and into 1931, Mrs. Chesterton became very ill. Frances became very ill and actually had to be hospitalized in Nashville for maybe 2 weeks. And Chesterton and his secretary had to continue going on some of the lectures on their own. And then Chesterton actually traveled by himself for a while, but he was warmly welcomed in Tennessee. And one of those quotes about the best lecture I ever heard was a reporter in Tennessee.
That's great. Josh Copeland, our executive director, will be thrilled to hear that. He's going to Tennessee and Nashville next week. He'll make a pilgrimage, I think, to find that hospital. I wonder if the trip to Notre Dame obviously means a lot to us, and we're so grateful to be identified with Chesterton, especially in his home country. I'm wondering, we're especially grateful to Aiden Mackey, and I know you've known him for a very long time, and you were a trustee of the Chesterton Library, as it was. And I'm just curious as to what you might say about Aiden's contribution to the Chesterton legacy.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to speak about that. First of all, the fact that I have seen that collection that Notre Dame is now the caretaker of. I've seen it in 4 different settings. It's just wonderful that Notre Dame has now created such a permanent and fine location for it, because that was one of the great risks, that this collection was not going to be kept together and be such a wonderful source for scholars. And that was Aiden's dream. He did all this lifetime of work, not only collecting original Chesterton material and things directly connected to his life, but the supporting books. When Chesterton writes about another book, Aiden Mackey hunted down that book. So that book now is part of the collection in there. And so you can basically see what Chesterton was reading, that he was reacting to or expounding on, thanks to his wonderful work there. Aiden is time doesn't seem to have dulled him in the least. He's as witty and wonderful as he always has been since I've ever known him. I first met him in 1990, I guess it was. And at age 99, he's still as bright and funny as ever. I just enjoy my email exchanges with him. I certainly hope to be there next year to celebrate his 100th with him. but he continues to make himself available to people who want to do research and ask questions, because he knows things that nobody else knows. And he keeps saying, I'm going to retire. He has unsuccessfully retired for almost 40 years.
Yes, he's a remarkable man. So 4 of us are going to go out and visit him next week. We have such a deep affection for him and such gratitude for the legacy that he's created in the collection, in his wisdom. And you're right, he's just endlessly brilliant and the great humorist. Chesterton would have loved him. They would have been a great pair together. What do students of Chesterton regard as the particular merit of the everlasting man? More than the rest.
Yeah, that's the book that we teach that as our capstone book at Chesterton Academies. So
I imagine
the freshmen are exposed to an introductory book on Chesterton written by some guy named Ahlquist, and that's their first exposure to Chesterton here. Yeah, and then their sophomore year they read Orthodoxy and they read St. Francis of Assisi. They also read in their junior year the Ballad of the White Horse, the Lepanto poem, and the book on St. Thomas Aquinas, because they will be studying Thomas Aquinas in their philosophy classes here. The great thing about the Everlasting Man senior year is it really brings together everything they've been studying for the last 4 years. It's the entire history of the world compacted into 2 parts. The first part 1 is on the creature called man, and part 2 is on the man called Christ. And he talks about how civilization unfolds in the first part and brings in, mythology, history, anthropology, art, and it tells this marvelous story of how the world is looking for something and they're not finding it. And the 2 rivers of religion and philosophy are running parallel, but they don't intersect until Christianity comes along. And when Christ steps onto the stage, history changes completely. And there's simply no other explanation for what happens in history unless Christ was who he said he was. And all the other explanations falter. And he gets us to look at Christianity as if we are outsiders rather than being too close to it as we normally are. Even the people who don't believe in Christianity are too close to it to see it for what it is. And the whole purpose of this book is to move us back far enough and look at it as the strange thing it is, and how it does offer the complete explanation of everything, unlike any other explanation. Chesterton's book is really a tour de force, The Everlasting Man, and every time you read it, you get something new out of it.
Yep. Dale, yesterday someone pointed out that the Wall Street Journal yesterday published an editorial commentary by Kyle Mann that quoted Chesterton, and the quote was, "It is the test of a good religion, whether you can joke about it," end quote. And it was in reference to today's cancel culture and the Netflix David Chappelle controversy. It does seem that Chesterton remains relevant in so many ways.
Yeah, I was just with Kyle Mann a couple weeks ago. He's from the Babylon Bee, a wonderful satirical website that its byline is fake news you can trust. And one of the things that they do is they make fun of their own religion. They're all Christians who write this, and they make fun of the strange foibles in their own churches. And Chesterton is one of their heroes. As Chesterton says, the test of a good religion is whether you can joke about it. And Chesterton knew how to laugh at himself and laugh at the things that he loved. It shows a type of security and a type of solidness to it. The cynical laughs as an outsider. Chesterton laughs as an insider.
Yes, well said. Yeah. Many are fascinated by the people that he met along the way, especially during his visits and where he visited. One has asked if there is a list somewhere of the cities that Chesterton visited on his visits.
Oh yeah, there's a list. I have that list in my computer.
We're gonna get that list from him, I think.
Yeah, that's not a problem to produce that list.
All right. And you know, you said he met Jack Dempsey almost randomly, but what do you imagine Mrs. Custer wanted to say to G.K. Chesterton?
Yeah, since I just discovered this meeting, I am now fascinated, and all of her papers are kept in I think South Dakota. There's a connection with a Custer Memorial there, and I'm going to do some research because I would love to know if she wrote anything down about that meeting. It's just a fascinating connection.
Yeah, absolutely. In an interview with Robert Barron, the bishop said that Leonard Cohen got his famous line, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in," from G.K. Chesterton. Is that true? And is it in fact a quotation, or is it more correct to say that Cohen got the sentiment from Chesterton?
Well, I can't verify that Cohen got it from, but it's certainly an explicit Chesterton idea that sometimes we need a crack in our head to let the light through. That's a direct Chesterton quotation. It may have filtered to Leonard Cohen, or maybe he was reading G.K. Chesterton in the dark ages, the 1970s.
Mm-hmm. Can't be sure.
Right.
I'll give it to Chesterton.
Yeah.
This I find a very interesting question. What book still needs to be written about G.K. Chesterton?
Well, I'm working on 2 of those books right now. One of them, I'm trying to do a very thorough and complete answer to the criticism that Chesterton was anti-Semitic. I don't believe it for a minute, and I will always defend him against that charge. But I think the charge mostly comes from ignorance, but sometimes it does come from malice. The whole point is, if we get all the facts out there in a scholarly and complete way, then people can make their own decision based on the facts and based on the whole of Chesterton. It doesn't do any good to take one quote out of context and use it to really malign Chesterton. And so that's one book that needs to be written, and I'm working on it. The other book that I'm working on is a totally different biography of Chesterton from any other that we've seen, and it's using as much of Chesterton's own writing to tell his story. Now, he wrote an autobiography, but his autobiography is mostly about other people and hardly mentions himself. But in his journalism, which 5,000 essays, Father, he reveals a lot of himself. There's a lot of autobiographical material in these essays, and in other books where there's an aside where he talks about something that affected him personally in his life. And I'm assembling that into creating a much broader and yet new perspective of Chesterton, really from his own eyes.
I love that. We're going to look forward to those. We're going to have them in our collection.
Okay, great.
Dale, 2 questions to wrap up. One, first, one more about who he knew in his lifetime, whom we're all fascinated with. Can you expound briefly on Chesterton's professional relationship with George Bernard Shaw?
Yes, Chesterton and Shaw were very much intellectual opponents, philosophical opponents, but they were close personal friends, and they never had any animosity towards each other, though they always argued against each other publicly, and I'm sure privately as well. They had some famous debates where people paid to see them argue with each other, and always they had the warmest respect for each other. It's a model relationship of how you get along with your enemies. Chesterton and Shaw had never had anything bad to say about each other at all. And it's great to see the way they always defended each other, even though they disagreed on many things. Yeah.
We could all benefit from that.
Amen.
And then the final question is quite lovely. Could you talk about the unique joy found in Chesterton's fiction and essays in books like The Napoleon of Notting Hill or The Club of Queer Trades? His fiction seems to be underrated, and I'm just wondering if you can expound a little bit on the joy that might be found in them.
Yeah, certainly his fiction is underrated, and I certainly recommend people to pick up his novels and his stories. The one thing, of course, that's not underrated are his Father Brown stories, which continue to have great popularity. And it would be even better if the BBC series started faithfully recreating them. But at least they point to the goodness of the character of Father Brown. But the joy, yes, the joy is absolutely evident. Chesterton certainly loves the characters that he creates, even the bad characters. He tries to give them a dignity that shows that no one is without the ability to be redeemed. Even the bad ones, who you have to have evil in your stories, otherwise there's no proper conflict. But he always is hoping that possibly his evil characters can be converted. Not all of them are. I think one of probably Chesterton's greatest novel is The Man Who Was Thursday, and probably more people know about that one than the others. But there's this ongoing theme in there that that the person you think is your enemy actually is your ally, and that's wonderfully done in that book, The Man Who Was Thursday. Club of Queer Trades is again his thing of taking something unexpected and showing a truth from that. Chesterton's point about the truth is it always comes as a surprise, and that's when it's most effective, is when it comes unexpected and as a surprise. And then the Napoleon of Notting Hill, which was his first novel, excuse me about that, his first novel, The Napoleon of Notting Hill, is a novel with no women in it. And it's this defense of the local, the defense of the thing that is closest to you, that you love. And that was an inspiration to the Irish revolutionary Michael Collins. When he read that novel, he realized it's possible for Ireland to be independently ruled again. That was his inspiration. So
thank you, Dale. I want to thank everyone who's joined us today. It's a great pleasure to have had you join us, especially you, Dale. It's truly an honor to have you here, and we're going to bring you back again, you can be sure. I'd also like to thank again our co-sponsors for this event, the Society of G.K. Chesterton, the Nanovic Institute, the Nicholas Center, the Office of Notre Dame International, the Notre Dame College of Arts and Letters, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, ThinkND, and the Durham University Center for Catholic Studies. Keep an eye out for us. We have ongoing programming, and we're always happy to have you join us when you're able. Dale, God bless you, and God bless your good work.
Thank you, Father. God bless you. See you in person someday soon.
Yes, we're going to work that out.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Take care.